Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll just be waiting on a few more people and then we'll get going. So thanks for being here. Hi, we're just waiting a few more minutes, but I think we're at 3 minutes. So thanks for sending that question. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Um, this is our webinar on can ecosystem service benefits be assessed and evaluated for IPM practices. We have several different sponsors today. So FAR, the IPM Alliance, Nestle, and then BPIA. And Tian, would you mind going to the next slide? So today so my name is Erika Peirce. I am a scientific program manager at the Foundations for Food and Agricultural Research. I'm going to do the welcome and then we'll continue on and introduce all of our speakers. And then we'll have the speaker presentations, the Q&A, and then we'll close out. So first, a little bit, Tian, okay. So first so during the first part of this dialogue, participants will be muted, but please ask any questions in the chat or the Q&A. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentations, and we will record and share the webinar and share it with you over email. It'll also be available on our website. So just an introduction about FAR. FAR aims to build unique public-private partnerships that connects funders, researchers, and farmers to provide every person access to affordable, nutritious food grown on thriving farms. FAR is an independent 501c3 organization that was created in the 2014 Farm Bill to increase public agricultural research investments and to fill knowledge gaps and complement USDA's research agenda. We funded numerous awards, and currently we have 4 priority areas that we're working with: the cultivating thriving production systems, bolstering healthy food systems, sustaining vibrant agro ecosystems, and strengthening the scientific workforce. So the FAR, what we call the FAR factor. FAR's research aims to complement USDA's research agenda, fill critical knowledge gaps, increase public agricultural research investments, and we want to focus on actionable science that involves farmers to solve current challenges. We really aim to move research from the lab into the field. So that's a little introduction about what FAR is. I wanted to briefly introduce IPM, Integrated Pest Management's role in ecosystem services. So agroecosystems provide ecosystem services like nutrient cycling, soil health, and natural pest control. IPM's role is to support these processes rather than to disrupt them. So some examples include always awkward with animations. Some examples include crop diversity and rotation, and this can help break pest cycles and support beneficial insects, but also these crop rotations with crops like legumes can add nitrogen into the system. And if we have crops with diversified root systems, we can feed a wider range of soil microbes as well. Next slide. Okay. And then as I'm sure a lot of us here, oh, sorry, Tian, back. I'm sure a lot of us here are aware that a major component of IPM is to reduce chemical disturbance, and we often do that using things like economic threshold guidance, so we can maintain soil health and and improve microbial activity by reducing chemical inputs. So together, this strengthens biological pest control. Next slide. Awesome. So right now, a lot of IPM, as I mentioned before, is really based on chemical control, and it operates as an input substitution. So just using pesticides more efficiently. That's a lot of the definition in people's brains. But to truly support ecosystem services, IPM needs to shift towards a system redesign where biodiversity and ecological interactions are built into the system. This includes managing at larger levels because services like biological control and pollination depend on that landscape scale diversity, not just individual fields. Another limitation is measurement. We often just track yield or pest levels, but not ecosystem services like soil health or natural enemy activity. So advancing IPM means moving to more of from a reactive tool to a proactive ecological management system. All right, next slide. So why is FAR interested in supporting IPM? We believe that one of our main priorities is tools, technologies, and integrated models designed at scales needed for site-specific decision-making, allowing producers to create, build, and maintain productive agroecosystems. And we believe that IPM is an integral part of the development of a healthy and productive agroecosystem. So to achieve the systems level approach, we believe FAR is really uniquely positioned because we work closely with partners, researchers, and farmers. And IPM cannot be treated as a standalone topic. So it needs to intersect biology, technology, and management. It needs to bridge sustainability and profitability and enable resilient systems level agriculture. So that's why we're here today, and we're going to have an amazing discussion. But first, I'm going to pass it over to Jim to introduce the IPM Alliance.
All right. Thank you, Erika, for that introduction. And thank you also for FAR's great collaboration with IPM Alliance on this project. So my role this morning is to give a brief introduction to IPM Alliance. My name's Jim Farrar. I'm on the IPM Alliance Board of Directors, and I'm also the director of the Integrated Pest Management Program at University of California. So IPM Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit. The nonprofit is a reimagining or a redesign of the previous IPM Voice. So IPM Voice has now transitioned to become the IPM Alliance. The IPM Alliance recently completed a project led by Larry Elworth and funded by USDA and RCS, which is along the lines of what we're talking about today in providing incentives to growers for adoption of IPM practices. And this project was in partnership with IPM Institute, the American Society of Agronomy, and NC State University. I'm going to put a link in the chat to the 3 recorded webinars from that project, and I'll do that as soon as I'm done speaking. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this new project that we've undertaken at IPM Alliance with FAR is to co-design public-private research collaboration to fund and conduct research on IPM practices that not only meet the needs of agricultural producers, which is sort of a traditional approach in IPM, but also with supply chains. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll see the objectives in a little bit more detail. So the objectives of this FAR IPM Alliance collaboration are, like I said, encourage and support new and innovative research to meet challenges in the field, support creation of new knowledge and innovation, both focused on new IPM technologies, but also development of economic valuation methods for those IPM benefits. And then through that evaluation, create wider support and collaboration through the agricultural supply, risk management, and finance chains. And I think that that is really the innovation in this project, is linking more broadly into those chains. And then by doing that, we hope to make more resources available to support the economic and environmental viability of farmers through greater IPM adoption. So now today's webinar is focused on that assessing and placing value on ecosystem services from IPM, and I'll turn it over to our moderator, Sarina.
Thank you very much, Jim. Could you go to the next slide? Thanks, Tien. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Sarina. Oh, sorry, we'll go back one, Tien. Sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Sarina Macfadyen. I'd like to start today with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, which are the traditional custodians of the land in which I'm based today. So I'm here in Canberra, Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I'd also like to thank FFAR and the IPM Alliance for providing us with the opportunity to have this discussion today. Next slide, thanks. So I work for CSIRO, which is Australia's federal research organisation. I'm a research scientist, and I work on a whole range of different projects associated with IPM across time. One of the current projects that my team is involved with is really focused on how we can enable the better use of beneficial natural enemies for pest management in canola production systems. This is a photo of our team taken earlier in the year. This project is funded by the Grains Research and Development Corporation and has partners across all of Australia. And some of these natural enemies, particularly the predators like the lacewings, lady beetles and spiders, and also the parasitic wasps, are really important for pest control, but we hear a lot from canola growers that they really struggle to manage these species in an active way. So our project is trying to enable both tools, practices and knowledge that is really going to shift how they manage these beneficial species and also how they're used within an IPM framework, hopefully. Next slide, thanks. So CSIRO has been involved in a whole range of different IPM projects across time. One of the more successful case studies that we like to highlight is around Australian cotton. In the sort of 70s to 80s, Australian cotton was really going through a difficult period in terms of having very high pest outbreaks from one of their key moth pests. This was driven mainly through resistance development in that particular moth pest, and CSIRO scientists, along with their collaborators in universities and state departments, was really integral in the development of the GM cotton varieties, the technology associated with the expression of BT within those cotton varieties, and integrating that into the cotton breeding pool that was in existence. This enabled a real step change in how cotton producers managed a whole range of pest species. Next slide, thanks, Tien. But the scientists involved didn't just work on the technology themselves and the development of that technology. They also worked quite heavily on some detailed stewardship options for how to maintain that technology long term. And we now have resistance management plans for BT cotton that's updated annually. There's also was a big step change in the management of insecticide resistance in traditional pesticide options as well. There was also a really heavy push on the development of the diversity of different practices to manage pests within an IPM framework, and the integration of those practices into a really cohesive program of work for cotton growers. And I think it's all these three things combined that really led to the system level change that we see today, where insect pests are managed in a much more sustainable manner. All this work has led to an Australian cotton brand that Australian cotton producers are really proud of and has a good reputation for sustainably produced cotton. So it is a real success story and illustrates how combining these different elements can lead to a large system level change. Next slide, thanks. So there's a whole range of drivers for IPM adoption that have been touched on in some of the previous webinars. The cotton example is a traditional one where we see resistance development in a major pest species that's caused by an over-reliance on a few pesticides, and this leads to a crisis within an industry, and that's a fairly large driver of change. But there's also other more subtle drivers that are going on, things like changing to market standards around environmental risks and deregulation of older technology and the limited development of new chemical pesticides, which also can facilitate change. Next slide. We're actually not going to dwell on this today, though. What we want to talk about today is really some of these new opportunities or incentives that might facilitate IPM adoption that are associated with payments for ecosystem services. Payments for ecosystem services aren't new, both in the public and the private space. They've been around since the 1980s, but we've really seen a growing momentum in this space recently associated with both carbon trading schemes and greenhouse gas mitigation practices. There's also been an increased interest in sustainability premiums across a range of different industries, and there's been a bigger push for regenerative ag practices in a lot of different systems around the world. I think what these things all have in common, what these schemes or initiatives all have in common, is they're more focused on the way we farm rather than what's just being produced on the farm, and being able to communicate the way we farm to stakeholders in the value chain. And that's the sort of the central premise of our discussion today. Next slide, thanks. So we've got a fantastic panel today to go through this with you. We're going to talk about if and how ecosystem service benefits can be assessed and valued for IPM practices. That includes carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, but also some of the other ecosystem services associated with biodiversity, water and soil quality, even some of the services around how that can impact the resilience of different systems to pest outbreak risk, and also what that risk means for growers and the way they produce food, and other factors that we might call a collection of co-benefits that is yet still unclear about how they're going to be assessed. Next slide, thanks. So here's our panelists today. We've got an amazing group of people to talk through this discussion. We've got Reagan Cerci from Boundless Impact Research and Analytics, Whitney Kakos from KDP MOTS. We've also got Dr. Julie Nash from Winrock International and Ryan Tregaskes from Ecosystem Services Markets Consortium. What we're going to do is give each of these panelists a good amount of time to introduce themselves and the work that they do. And then you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions of them. You're welcome to put those questions into the Q&A box right now or as people are presenting, so that you don't forget the questions you want to ask. And we've got plenty of time. So by all means, let's take a bit of time to really get in depth into this topic and see if we can come up with some new ideas going forward. I might hand over now to our first panelist, Reagan.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. As Sarina just said, my name is Reagan Cerci. I'm a senior research analyst at Boundless Impact Research and Analytics. I'm going to speak a little bit about Boundless's work in the space and how we got to building this new LCA TEA, or Lifecycle Assessment Techno-Economic Analysis Modeling platform, to uncover ecosystem impacts in integrated pest management. Next slide. So a little bit of background and what is LCA, just in case anyone isn't aware. Life cycle assessment is a way to quantify the environmental impact of a product through its entire life cycle. So if you're looking at something like a biopesticide, that would be not just the environmental impact on field when it is applied, but also the impact of the raw material extraction, energy use for manufacturing, packaging, and then up to the final use phase and end of life. Next slide. This is governed by an ISO standard. It's the ISO 1400 series. You'll see the concept of an ISO compliant LCA passed around a lot. A fully ISO compliant LCA has very strict standards for the reporting, and can be anywhere from 60 to 100 pages long. Boundless found that this was not entirely necessary for all companies who were just trying to get an understanding of their environmental impact or communicate their impact to stakeholders. So we have actually iterated on this, next slide, and made a more accessible version. So this is what we call the Boundless baseline LCA. It follows those ISO standards in the modeling, but translates the results into an investor and customer-friendly report. So the goal is to communicate the impact to the consumer. And it helps companies differentiate their product and gain faster traction and market share. Next slide. The way that we do this is by assessing different environmental key performance indicators. Each industry can have unique eKPIs, and we try to keep a consistent list of eKPIs per industry, and ensure an apples to apples comparison as well. Next slide. Some examples of this in the IPM space is an assessment we did here where we looked at not only the GHG or carbon footprint, but also carbon return on investment, some pollinator toxicity potential, soil toxicity, aquatic toxicity, human toxicity, and then the proportion of harmful materials. So LCA can be applied very broadly to a variety of different toxicity metrics, as well as the sort of gold standard, which is the carbon or GHG footprint. Next slide. Across these metrics, we like to benchmark to competitors. So putting the product that we're assessing, whether that be biocontrol, we want to put it in context of what else is in this space, right? So we not only assess that technology, but we pull in results from what might be a business as usual, a more conventional, or a direct competitor within the space to show the results in a graph like this, where there's a spider chart and you can see clearly how a company is performing in comparison to the benchmarked technologies. And it allows for easier decision making when in production, but also when you're trying to decide, which pest management strategy to follow. Next slide. So we don't know what happened there, but we built this extra tool because we realized that there was another gap in the space, right? So you have these formal written documents that are final and they're not interactive. You can't change the inputs. You can't see what different scenarios might do to your environmental impact. And we wanted to make it easy for companies or farmers to go in and see what integrating something into their process might do in a future scenario. And so we built this Boundless LCA calculator. Next slide. Combining the rigorous LCA methods and the scenario analysis, eliminating the estimation. So you can see the interface here. Essentially, you go in and you are selecting from these drop-downs of materials and inputting the exact amount of water or pesticide or raw material that you were using and saving those scenarios. And then you can compare directly across scenarios in product, either its manufacturing or use. In this case, the scenario is looking at different recycled packaging options. And so how would it impact my cost of production and my carbon footprint if I were to swap out to a recycled packaging, right? It might be more expensive, but it has a lower carbon footprint. And what is the trade-off there? Next slide. The graphics are fully interactive, and this is really helpful for identifying hotspots in a system, right? So you can click in and see within my raw materials, aluminum is the primary driver here. And the goal, again, is so that you don't actually have to have detailed LCA knowledge to understand what you're looking at, and you can also choose your level of granularity. We really want to help drive those earlier stage decisions so that you can consider the environmental impact and run scenarios early on without having your full process identified in a formal written report. Next slide. So you can see here those what if scenarios. This is a case scenario where we're looking at the baseline, which is, a generic energy grid compared to a production using a wind or solar as an energy grid. So this is in the production of a biocontrol of some kind. And you can compare directly across one product, or next slide, across a product line, which can help identify the easiest places across the product line to reduce your overall impact or cost of production. So you can see here, product 3 has a significant amount of electricity that is contributing to their overall footprint. So there's a clear place for reduction there. Next slide. So this is all structured to be done very quickly, from kickoff call to access to the modeling platform. Our goal is to keep it under 2 weeks. As I said, Boundless is really trying to drive early stage decision making and help companies structure their production based on these not just environmental, but also economic results, so that they have access to these impacts and scenarios earlier on and can make decisions on their process based on that. Next slide. Thank you. My information is on the screen, my email. If you have any questions following the webinar, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you very much for that, Reagan. We might go to our next presenter, Whitney.
Yep. Hi, guys. Thanks very much. Just checking everybody can hear me. Good? Yes. Okay. I'm going to start with just a quick introduction of who is Keurig Dr. Pepper. I expect many here might be scratching their heads saying, oh, I've heard of those separately, not necessarily together. So it's a pleasure to be here. Let me demystify this. Keurig Dr. Pepper is very much kind of a house of brands. So you can see on the left here some of the brands underneath this umbrella, but it's a company that came together from a coffee company and a beverage company back in 2018. What I want to speak to you about today is some work going on within one particular supply chain of KDP, which is the Mott's Apple supply chain. So if you live in the US, you have probably heard of Mott's. It's been around quite a long time as a brand, really well known for applesauce and apple juice. And it's the applesauce supply chain I'd like to speak to you about today. Before I jump into that, I am calling in today from the Boston area. I'm a senior director leading sustainability for KDP in particular areas. So climate and nature, water, human rights, livelihoods. So let me tell you a little bit about Mott's. This is one of the most unique supply chains I think anyone doing this type of work has the opportunity to work on because it is so short. So we are buying directly from around 100 farmers who are located in upstate New York, very close to where we have a plant that is manufacturing applesauce. So as far as supply chains go, it's hyper local. It is very traceable. We have both an opportunity and a responsibility for impact here. So that's what I mean when I say this is a very unique supply chain within the whole portfolio of Keurig Dr. Pepper. And we knew coming in that this was a place where we wanted to take action on that opportunity and responsibility. So we waded in and quickly realized in this segment of food and bevs, which is processing apples, meaning not fresh apples that are going into grocery stores whole, which our farmers also grow. Processing apples are sort of like an ignored corner of the industry. The apples earn a lower margin. They're kind of sometimes treated differently. You're not worrying about blemishes, et cetera. So the economic picture looks different. And truly, it's been kind of ignored in areas of research, for example, on what is the true cost of production for processing apples? And if you want to tinker with the agrochemical costs, for example, what does that do? So there was just not a lot for us to work with. So we had some white space here as we were figuring out how do we engage in this really close-knit, close to our company community, and try to align on how we can have a positive impact. So we knew that the hotspots within this supply chain really were about pest management and biodiversity impacts. If you compare growing apples in upstate New York to growing apples in Washington State, you're kind of growing them in a desert over there. The pest pressure is not the same. There's so much more organic production from the West Coast for that reason versus this area of the Northeast. So it's very unique from its pest management challenges as well. So we found a way to try to align on incentives with this group of growers. And an important piece of this and an ability for us to take action here was around a public goal that our company created around regenerative agriculture. So that term has come up already from some of the other speakers. KDP has a public goal around supporting regenerative agriculture or conservation. They are related, but different, on 250,000 acres of land by 2030. Now we are activating on this goal, if you will, in apple, which we'll talk about more in just a second, but also coffee and also corn. And of course, it looks very different depending on which of these. But Tian, if you go to the next slide, I'll explain a bit more this engagement with Mott's apple growers. Thank you. So a few years ago, we launched what we have called a native pollinator program. And we were very clear at the beginning that we wanted this to be a voluntary program. This was not a top-down, but more of a bottom-up approach. And we really wanted it to be targeted because, like I said, margins are not very big in this part of the supply chain. And we knew that we really needed this to be feasible for growers to participate in. We also know that pretty much all growers are renting honeybees every year as an insured way of pollination. Thousands of dollars are spent on this. If you've never seen this, this is literally semi-trucks hauling in beehives on pallets that are put out onto the farms in the particular weeks of bloom when pollination needs to occur. And this is a critical step of ensuring your yield. So super important to growers. At the same time, we know that native pollinators do a better job at pollination than these rented honeybees. They're adapted for the job, they're adapted for the climate, but there have been challenges. I'm sure many on this webinar are aware of issues with honeybees and also just pollinators in general. So we were able to play this convening role, partnering with the IPM Institute of North America, with Cornell University, who's also in this region, of course, of upstate New York, and two particular labs focused on pollinators and native pollinators in apple, even, and then also linking into public funds if they're available through the soil and water districts. So here we are, finding ways to incentivize these practices that can support pollinators on the farm and also can contribute to KDP's goal. So next slide, Tian. I only have one more, guys, and it's really to kind of break apart the program for you in a little more detail. So like I said, we really wanted it to be feasible for growers. So around 15 growers signed up for phase one of the program, which was 2023 to 2025. And we landed on a kind of stepped gradual program where deeper engagements were being added year on year. So in year one, growers were asked to use an adjusted spray program that was very focused on bloom and the native pollinators in apple orchards at bloom. So between Cornell and the IPM Institute, we were able to come up with what are the pollinators we care about the most and how do we protect them best. So growers needed to adjust their sprays to follow that guidance. They also underwent a habitat evaluation from the lab at Cornell. So the researcher came out to their orchards, assessed their habitat, and they almost got a report card saying, okay, right now your habitat is a C+. Here's what you could do in order to improve the habitat for pollinators on your orchard. And then in the beginning, we had growers trained by Cornell to actually go out and do bee abundance assessments on their orchards visually, saying, okay, for 5 minutes, you're looking in this kind of square of space and counting the bees that you are seeing. And in year one, that was the extent of our kind of impact assessment. In year two, adjusted spray programs, that continues the whole time. Growers were digesting that habitat assessment and then coming up with what would they do to improve it. So that's what I mean by what's your plan? Submit back to us what you can do with this information. In year two, we were able to upgrade to the Cornell researcher actually doing the bee abundance surveys themselves. It's not easy for very busy farmers to fit it in, and we wanted to have better data. So Cornell was able to do that. In year three, which was just last year in 2025, growers actually installed the habitat per the plans that had been agreed prior. And we had some lucky timing with another PhD student at Cornell who took this on as part of her PhD. So we were able to really up the level of impact measurement with this student and some other staff from Cornell doing things like slicing into apples from each farm, looking at how many seeds were inside. So basically more detailed measurement of pollination, how well it was happening, and then actually netting bees out there to get a really more accurate picture of what was going on. All along this, years 1 through 3 of this first phase, what was KDP doing? KDP was doing the convening, so bringing these experts together, funding those experts to implement the project, but also providing to growers a $1 per acre incentive to cover the costs of these changes. And I heard the economics mentioned before. This is such a big need where we know that we need good data on exactly what it costs as a baseline to grow these apples. And then, like I said, if you're making changes, what is the impact of those changes? And that's an area that's still, there's an economist coming in as part of the PhD students' work as well. And we're really looking forward to getting some good data there on the economics. So to finish out, I'm excited to say that this year, the pollinator program is continuing. And what we learned from phase 1 when we looked at the data was that forests, we can tell, are playing a particularly impactful role on native pollinators and them being there. There's this correlation to forests that are bordering the enrolled acreage. So we will continue with the adjusted spray program. The growers are moving in now to maintaining the habitat that has been installed on their orchards or around their orchards. The new component we are looking to add this year is digging in deeper to the forest piece. So we just signed a partnership with the Cerci Society, who is going to be working this year to create guidance for foresters who can create forest management plans with native pollinators in mind. So forest management plans are there. They often have different objectives for the forest owner. The goal here is to educate foresters and work with a particular forester in the region to kind of create almost like a protocol that has pollinator health and support in mind within a forest management plan. And then the idea is growers for whom it's applicable can receive one of these forest management plans as part of their participation in the program. So we're really excited for that. And I think that speaks a little bit to what you were saying. It might have been you, Erika, on just, it's not just about the field, it's about this bigger landscape around it that is part of this bigger ecosystem. So lots of ties here, but it's really exciting. It's one of my favorite pieces of work in doing supply chain work. So happy to be with you all today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Whitney. That was a really interesting case study. Julie, are you able to present now?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Be able to move to the Winrock slides. So my name is Julie Nash. I am the Director of Ecosystem Services at Winrock. I just want to check to be able to make sure that everyone's able to see and hear me. Is that correct? Great. Thumbs up. That's fantastic. So, just a little bit of my own personal background, and then I'll talk about Winrock. So, I come from the food company side first. So, I worked about 15 years for groups such as Unilever, Kraft, and worked on the kind of the marketing and new business development sides, including a stint at Ben and Jerry's for many years. And then I went back to get my PhD in natural resources with the focus in on economics. So sitting on this panel has been fantastic just to be able to hear ecosystem services, economics, and incentives brought together because that is a personal passion of mine. So if we can go to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about Winrock. So Winrock is an international organization. We have projects that happen in the United States, but then also in Asia, in Africa, in Central and South America, and really across the globe, usually focused in on agriculture, energy, or the environment. The group that I focus in on is ecosystem services, and we focus on forestry and then the valuation and measurement of ecosystem services. We look at our mission as really being able to unlock climate finance for nature and people. When I was starting within this kind of world of valuation of ecosystem services about 15 years ago, you were always looking for case studies. And what's so great about a meeting like today is that we're kind of living those case studies and we can talk about those case studies in detail. If we go to the next slide, I just want to talk, and we've had a great background in terms of integrated pest management. I think that what we see within this area is that the payments are tied not necessarily to an individual integrated pest management program or system. What we're seeing is that they are tied to the benefits. So we've talked earlier about biodiversity conservation and pollination services, but there are also benefits that come from water quality protection. Climate health and climate mitigation are something that I specialize in, and I'll talk more about. But then there's also overall soil health. I know that there was a discussion earlier on microbial communities. And then there's also reduced human health risks because these diversified farming systems are just more resilient to the climate shocks. So what we do within our group is really be able to look at each one of these, what we consider benefit streams, and then figure out ways to be able to value those services. So a lot of our work has to do with standards, with carbon credits, again, looking for ways to be able to develop these kind of market-based instruments or to be able to support market-based instruments to be able to pay for this type of work. So we'll go to the last slide. So I just want to be able to talk a little bit about the incentives. So there have been great discussions already about how Mott is paying directly to the producers for adoption of practices. And we're seeing more and more of this, buyer sourcing commitments. And those buyer commitments may be a price premium, which we have here and we've talked about, but it also could be a longer contract or a specific amount that they are willing to be able to buy. So we've seen actual shifts in sourcing commitments that are due to the ecosystem services. A lot of this, as been said before, is climate-based. Price premiums. This is something that has really grown over time. Again, 20 years ago, maybe I'm dating myself by saying that, you would not have necessarily seen the type of amount of eco labels. I think of something like Rainforest Alliance. A lot of times these environmental labels or these different type of certifications, sometimes they don't end up on a label, are really bundling a certain kind of environmental ecosystem service directly with a product so that you know that you're getting these different services that come from buying this product. And then we also see things such as payment for ecosystem services. And we've seen this many times in terms of water quality outcomes, where you'll actually have different actors within an area who are willing to be able to pay for either pollution that's coming from a single point, or will develop incentive schemes for an entire region to be able to improve the water quality. So again, I know we're moving on to questions and I want to leave time for that. But when it comes to these type of incentives or market-based instruments, I have lots of different examples that I can share. But I will go ahead and close it out here so that we can leave more time for questions.
Thank you very much for that, Julie. Ryan, are you able to present?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
All right. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. I'm Ryan Tregaskes, CEO of ESMC. A little bit about us as we build the systems and market infrastructure that connect regenerative agriculture outcomes into the supply chain in North America. We are a project implementation provider. We provide MMRV services and very heavily R&D focused. So next slide. So what I'm going to talk about today is dive in a little bit how we're looking at the risk valuation of integrating IPM into the larger landscape ecosystem architecture. We see that the future relevance of IPM is probably not going to come from simply proving that it reduces pesticide or supports biodiversity. As we talked about before, we see that the real issue is whether IPM can become integrated into the next generation of these new agricultural operating systems that are now being built around measurable environmental performance, such as insets and offsets. Next slide. So I really think one thing we need to talk about is just being honest about the complexity that's involved with this. And that one of the challenges in ecosystem service markets is that people often assume that environmental benefit automatically translates into economic value, when in reality, there's a very large gap between those two things. That environmental benefit is important, but markets require structure to go along with those. Including baselines, consistency, methodologies that can operate across different geographies, reporting systems that supply chains and financial institutions can trust. And above all that, they require scale and practicality. And so I think that's where in the past we've seen a lot of well-intentioned environmental frameworks struggle. If they become too fragmented or too burdensome for producers, adoption slows very quickly, regardless of how environmentally beneficial that practice may be. Next slide. And looking at IPM, it presents a really interesting challenge because many of the most important benefits are system level benefits that aren't always directly observable. You see, reduced resistance pressure has enormous value. Protecting long-term effectiveness of pest management tools has enormous value. Reducing volatility inside production systems has enormous value. Improving resilience against changing pest migrations, climate variability, and biological pressure also with that has enormous value. But we look at how do we quantify these things credibly? How do we isolate the contribution of IPM versus weather, geography, crop rotation, fertility programs, biologics, or dozens of other variables inside an entire production system? Next slide. So looking at this, we're seeing that taking the discussion a little further beyond whether simply asking whether IPM creates ecosystem benefits. Our approach looking at it is which ecosystem benefits associated with IPM are quantifiable, practical to the producer, and economically relevant enough to support scalable valuation systems, because those aren't always the same thing. There are benefits that are environmentally meaningful but difficult to quantify consistently. There are benefits that are measurable but not economically relevant enough for markets to care about. And then there are benefits that potentially sit at the intersection of both of those. I think, for example, one of the most important future opportunities may not be the direct ecological valuation alone, but risk valuation. We're looking at what is the economic value of reduced resistance development across a major cropping system. What is the value of preserving options and pest management tools over a 10 to 20-year period? These are all very relevant questions that we're looking at on integrating this for today's ag market, especially taking into account when food companies, retailers, insurers, financial institutions are increasingly evaluating long-term operational resilience in the agricultural field. Next page. So right now, what we're seeing is across all the agriculture, there's a massive amount of infrastructure being built around environmental accounting, carbon, water, biodiversity frameworks, scope 3 supply chain reporting, and natural capital discussions. These are financial institutions are evaluating all the long-term environmental exposure inside their agriculture portfolios. And all of those systems together, we're seeing are moving toward one central question. And that's, can environmental performance be measured consistently enough to matter both operationally and economically? And I think that looking through that, that's how we should view IPM and how it translates and fits into this entire system. The opportunity is much larger than just simply creating another sustainability metric. Looking at this, it's determining whether IPM can be part of the measurable performance layer of modern ag today. And I think if we could put those together, the implication of those together can be very significant. Next slide. So to step back and take a look, I think this is where IPM could potentially become much more important strategically than many people realize. Because if agriculture is moving towards integrated environmental performance systems as a whole, then IPM can't remain isolated in just its own separate technical silo. It has to be integrated into the broader conversation around soil health, biodiversity, water quality, and most importantly, supply chain resilience. And not because we're looking at rebranding what it is, but because the entire agriculture system as a whole is becoming extremely integrated. And so if IPM is going to become part of that measurable ecosystem, I think there are several things that we have to look at to happen next in the market as we move this forward. We look at stop treating IPM as an isolated practice category and looking at it more as part of the integrated production system. The environmental value is often generated through effects across the broader systems, not through that single practice alone. And second, we need to identify which IPM-related outcomes are actually capable of supporting the scalable measurement frameworks. Not every environmentally positive outcome will be measurable enough or economically relevant enough for markets to operationalize. We've seen this in other areas that we've looked at when you start pulling out these metrics by themselves. And this all comes down to stacking together. What can we do to be more efficient across the acres that we're moving across? Ultimately, the future agricultural economy is likely going to reward integrated system performance, not the fragmented pieces that we're seeing now that we're just starting to move and coming together. And so I think what we're looking at here and what FFAR is moving forward is very important just for that reason. One of the themes of the idea is that IPM needs to be positioned inside the broader ecosystem services and regenerative agriculture conversations that are now shaping investment and policy decisions. And I think that's exactly right how we're moving this forward, because the systems and the financial structures being established today are going to shape ag and environmental markets for decades. So we see we're feeling a lot of the effects from 10 years ago or even 5 years ago in the ecosystem markets now. And I think that's going to continue to accelerate over the next 5 to 10 years out. Good. Next slide. So from our angle and how we look at this as a broader marketplace structure, I want to avoid oversimplifying what we're looking at, that not every ecosystem service tied to IPM will become monetizable. I don't think the future success of IPM depends entirely on whether direct monetization occurs. I think the bigger opportunity is integration into the larger operational and supply chain systems that increasingly reward measurable resilience and performance. We're starting to see that more and more on the corporate side and also the financial institution side. The future, as we move this down the road, is going to reward systems that can optimize, I think, three things simultaneously, and that's production, resource efficiency, and long-term system resilience. And I think that as we move these sophisticated IPM systems forward, they have the potential to contribute meaningful to all three. And so, we're going to have to really focus in on the scientific rigor, credible methodologies, and practical implementation frameworks. And I think with we're seeing a lot of new data analytics with the help of AI and modeling. We're starting to see all of these systems come together in a very organized and fashioned way to where we're not picking and choosing winners and losers. And so IPM is a very critical part of this, that we can start moving into these systems and work on the broader environmental markets. And so I think that's really where the opportunity is in front of us in this area. And that's all I have. So I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ryan. That was very interesting. It's time now that if anyone has questions for our panelists, they're welcome to put them into the Q&A box. And Tien, I have that up myself, so I can actually go through that myself, if that's all right with you. There's a couple of questions in there already, but just to kick it off, I wanted to get into a bit more detail with Ryan and just sort of ask a little bit more of a clarification about, the level of complexity and sophistication that you're talking about. We saw a really good simple example earlier from Whitney where, improved pollinator health on farm that can be translated really easily to indicators that people in the stakeholder chain, can relate to very easily. But when we start to talk about resistance and risk management and resilience, like they're much more complex and more sophisticated indicators of how we farm, as you've mentioned. Do you think the markets are ready for that? Do you think they're open to understanding that level of complexity and sophistication in a new way? Or is it a question of us gathering the right data to be able to explain that?
I think it's a combination of both. I think the markets are actually a little starved for that right now on the generating more information that can be provided out to them, but as long as it's done in a correct and cohesive manner, because it's been very fragmented up to this point where, we do have areas that are very simple. They're standardized on how we move forward, and it's across the board. We can see, easily almost plug and play options as to where other segments of this marketplace, we have no standardization. Basically, we're on the quantification side or MRV side. We're working under similar metrics, but not all exactly the same in combination with different geographies that we're in. And so I think simplification is going to be key as we move forward. Ease of use for the producer. We can throw as much information at them. They're already dealing with a lot. We have all the, from precision ag to just on-farm record keepings. They're dealing with multiple systems already. And so trying to have a standard ease of use product that's fully integrated, I think would be the great place to start, that they would really appreciate and help us drive this forward at an accelerated rate.
Thank you. Does any of the other panelists want to comment on that question about whether or not markets are ready for this increased level of sophistication of information about some of the ecosystem service benefits?
So I'd be happy to be able to add on to what Ryan had said. Overall, I think that there definitely is, right from what we see, certainly funding that is coming into the market to be able to pay for carbon benefits. For instance, we're working with Nestle, who's one of the sponsors here, and they're investing over $3 billion in terms of to be able to meet their goals. So there definitely is, and we're doing technical assistance and project validation for them. So we're looking across their portfolio. And so there definitely is funding that we are seeing both within carbon markets, within contracts that is going in to the climate. And we certainly see increasing momentum as the standards are focused. And we do see this translating to changes that are happening on the ground. This is based on measurable impact that you're able to see within the supply chain. So we're seeing that this is not something we could say 5 years ago. We're seeing that huge sea change that's happening, which is very encouraging. I think that within other ecosystem service benefits, my instinct is that water is going to be kind of the next large thing that we're going to be looking to be able to tackle. So I definitely agree with Ryan in terms of there's an element of looking across these systems and all of the benefits, but I think that there is a need to be able to galvanize on certain elements. So IPM has great benefits when it comes to carbon. It has great benefits when it comes to water. And I think to what Ryan was saying, instead of trying to talk about just IPM as a whole, it's a question of looking at the benefit streams and looking at what the market is doing and being able to make sure that IPM is positioned as one of the solutions that is able to meet these higher level benefits. But back to the question, we are seeing it is, 10 or 15 years ago when I was doing my PhD in this, I would never have imagined the world that we see now in terms of valuation of ecosystem services. So it is the market is definitely there to be able to pay for some of these practices.
Great. Julie, there's a sort of a separate question for you in the Q&A about different types of incentive schemes. And I think all of you have touched on different ways of incentivising change of practice on farm. I suppose the question from the audience member was about whether or not there are certain incentives that are more amenable to certain geographic areas. Obviously, a farmer in Australia might have a very different incentive model to someone in the US or someone in a different country. Have you seen, or some of those, have you got any insight into what are some of those differences across geographies for incentive schemes?
So I think that you're absolutely right. It depends on the area, the type of incentive schemes and the technical advisory that you need to be able to do for a project that's in Africa is fundamentally different in some ways than Vietnam or within the United States. So I think that you need to be able to have a system that is adaptable to each place. There are certain areas where water is even more than carbon just because of the issues within that surrounding area. So I do think that there are different benefits that will appeal to different communities and different private groups. I hope that kind of answers it. So yes.
That's good. And I would encourage any audience member, if they want some more in-depth examples and discussions with the panelists, I think we are going to provide an overview of this, and certainly I think all of the panelists would be willing to talk to the audience members in more detail about specific areas as well after this session. But just staying on that theme though, there was a question for Whitney around whether or not tax benefits as an incentive scheme around forestry, might have any connections or be able to facilitate some of the pollination work that you've been doing. Do you think tax benefits as a really specific incentive scheme has any potential?
Yes, it has certainly come up, and I think I can see in here that this question was linked particularly to forest management plans. So this is this new aspect I was mentioning. We are definitely aware that that is possible and are trying, as we create this new angle on forest management plans, to connect the producers to funding options, and that this tax benefit would be one of them. It seems a little bit like you were just saying, Julie, like this is such a local context. The local context matters so much. So it would be the state of New York, and what particularly the state of New York is incentivizing through these benefits is going to look totally different if this grower were in Michigan or in Washington State. So the short answer is yes. And maybe just an echoing of your point, Julie, that you really have to dig in deep to the particulars of the hyper local context you're operating in to figure out what might work and why, or why not.
Right. Thank you. I want to change tack now a little bit and talk about data and evidence for how particular practices are linked to ecosystem service benefits and how we measure those to some degree. Because there was a question from the audience about, what evidence is there around how forest management impacts pollinators, or how some of the IPM practices impact water quality. And I suppose my question is for Reagan is to make that a bit more clearer. What do you do if you have a life cycle assessment where you've got gaps or uncertainty? So we know that forest management may impact pollinators, but there's also a whole lot of other things that impact pollinators as well. So, in a life cycle assessment context, which you're familiar with, how do you deal with that level of uncertainty or gaps?
Yeah, so there are a couple different ways that we approach it in life cycle assessment, depending on where the uncertainty is. At the end of the day, life cycle assessment is not a direct measurement, so we are, to some extent, making a best quantification or estimation of impacts, right? And there are databases like EcoInvent or GREET that we rely on for emission factors that are globally and nationally recognized as reputable sources. In the case where there's a major data gap, which we have seen particularly in pest management, in a lot of older pesticides, the data is either non-existent or extremely outdated. We have been trying to fill those gaps by developing the LCIs internally. So we are actually currently working on a project that is funded through Biomade to produce life cycle assessments that are able to be shared broadly of these major data gaps. So really, you have to find a way to model the production of these technologies on your own. So you have to reach out to experts, people who've worked in the chemistry or the engineering, discuss with them how much energy, water, or raw materials are used in the production of these materials. What are the application rates, the densities once they're sent to the farm, and build out that LCI or life cycle inventory on your own, which is a large task, but is very rewarding when you get all of the data and can show those results.
That's great. Would you consider that to be a research area in terms of, are there particular gaps that are more problematic for doing a rigorous life cycle assessment than others, or you can pretty much, if there's a gap, it's a gap no matter where it is?
Yeah, there are gaps. If the material is a large percentage of the raw materials that are going into the process, obviously that's a much larger concern. If it's a very small percentage, under 5%, then the data gap is not as much of a concern. It's really about how much it's going to sway the needle one way or the other, which you can't always know until you have that impact factor. But usually you can rely on, if it's 50% by weight, it's going to have a large impact.
Okay, that's interesting. Ryan, just coming back to you, there was a question around, again, sort of related to this quantification of evidence and how we build evidence bases around some of these factors. But the audience member wanted to know if you've been able to assign a risk range metrics across, has there been any consistencies across the food and beverage industries that you work with in being able to assign some sort of risk metric that is useful, or is that an impossible dream?
It's not impossible, but it's variable across whoever that we're working with, obviously. We can assign certain risk attributes to practices and changes that are occurring in the field. Basically comes down to ROI and the risk reward of implementation changes and direct effect that we have on outcomes moving into the supply chain. And so while we're still working on this is an area still under development. We can and have been able to start to assign different values as to practice changes. I think this is what we're looking at with IPM and how far can we take certain risks or practice change before we start producing negative outcomes, or how can we move in to accelerate the positive side? So something that in this early market stage that we're putting a lot of work into, but I wish I could give you a firm yes or yes, we have this done now, but it's an ongoing and continuing process that is very high up. It's both important to the corporate side as well as the producer side.
Deanne, just checking in with you. Did you want to say anything or ask any questions? You okay? I think Tien's all right. I'm just checking in with our organizer to make sure I'm not going too far off track, but that's okay. I'll take that as a we're fine, we'll keep going. Thank you very much for that, Ryan. I wanted to know a little bit more about, data collection that's being carried out by local people. And we saw an example with Whitney where you had scientists involved, but also, on-farm data collection. And we know this is an area across the board, not just with IPM and ecosystem services, but there's a growing sort of desire to have data collected about the way we farm on, the way things are being produced on farm, and then communicating that through the state, through the value chain. I suppose, is there one solution to this? Should there be universal data collection standards that go across and take that out of the hands of people that are on farm? Or is there a better way of thinking about how this amazing amount of work needs to be done? Julie, you've got your hand up, so I'll go to you. Sorry, Julie, just unmute yourself.
Thank you. So I think that there's definitely a push for primary data collection, so that if someone is looking to be able to pay for an ecosystem service, they want it to be not just about the practice, but about the results that come from this. And I see that this is going to be one of the major trends that we're going to see over the next 5 years. I think something like soil health, large scale collection of data on soil health is something that definitely will need to be able to evolve. And there needs to be simpler and more efficient ways to be able to do that. I think that remote sensing, this is something that we see in forestry, is really taking off in terms of what remote sensing is able to do in terms of understanding the actual benefits that you have. Larger scale water testing is another thing. So one of the things that we do at Winrock is help develop monitoring, reporting, and verification systems. And we are looking to be able to figure out how to be able to scale those in a way so that you can really reduce the transaction cost right now of being able to monitor. Because I think that you're going to continue to see the drive, not just in terms of have you done the practice, but what is the result that is happening from that. And to be able to reduce that for both the farmer and be able to transmit that data throughout the value chain is going to be one of the biggest hurdles that we face in terms of increasing adoption.
So I suppose related to that then is there's a collection of questions in the Q&A around, are these the best practices to use for a certain outcome? And I think we can all think of examples in our heads where there's multiple practices that might all lead to a really good outcome, and there's no one best practice. Does anyone have any thoughts about how to clarify that with people in the value chain about actually, particularly in IPM, where there might be multiple practices that lead to increases in beneficials, and on some particular farm, they might be able to implement practice A, whereas on other farms, they might be able to implement practice B, but they both lead to benefits that are measurable and quantifiable and positive in some way. Does anyone have any thoughts about how to sort of deal with that disconnect to some degree?
I think,
Whitney?
Sarina, if I could chime in, I guess this is making me think a little bit of a pathway that I think has worked well for us in the private sector to fund some of this work in our supply chains, which is to have an overlying framework that had kind of a menu of options. So, well, for us, the roll-up was supporting regen ag or conservation on acres, and that's a metric that we could latch onto, that we could communicate to our shareholders and, you know, publicly give updates on progress against. But underneath that is a menu of practices and impacts that had to be a bit of a menu because of the supply chains that were part of our business. So you heard me mention earlier, coffee, corn, and apple. You can't really pick more different, I feel like, raw materials to be working with and to try to put under one umbrella of work. But the beautiful piece of that was in creating this menu that, yes, could roll up into a simple way of communicating. That menu allowed for diverse approaches on the farm that we could justify our support for, because you know we landed in a place that I don't think is uncommon here, where at least movement had to happen in at least two of the metrics that we cared about on any particular acre in order for us to count it as meeting our goal. And that's a public methodology, by the way. It's available on our website. I can stick a link in here afterwards. That's really important to us too, because as we've said before, there's lack of alignment on a lot of these things. So I think we've done a good job of trying to be very clear with what we mean when we communicate about it. But all that to say, that's one way we found to accommodate the need for something's going to fit here that is not going to fit here, that is not going to fit here. So we were able to kind of walk that line and allow for that difference, still within this umbrella of KDP's sustainability strategy and what we were trying to achieve at a high level.
Great. I think this is for anyone that would like to have a go at answering it, but there's a question about what are some of the research advances that need to be achieved in order to link IPM benefits at scale. So not picking on Whitney, but she gave an example where you had 100 apple producers, 15 signed up for this thing. Was that enough for you to achieve benefits? And if we really wanted to get 100% or 80% of uptake in any particular scheme, what are some of the challenges or things that we could do to overcome that scaling issue? I know that's a tough question. You can think of an example. Ryan, I don't know if you've got any examples that you can think of where you've managed to get uptake higher than you anticipated on something.
I was going to say, just it's been, data collection has always been our choke point through this, and how do we overcome that? And it's been being able to convey and translate achievable results, or at least the possibility of positive results, back to the producer, because it is the scale that we need to advance any new area forward has to be very large and cover many different geographies, whether we're doing just here in the US or internationally as well. And so monetization of the outcomes is always the first place that we go. If the producer is going to spend time and take the effort to provide data back to us, that they're compensated for that, and rightfully so. And so that's, I would say, is probably our number one motivator to gain data out there and gain data that's relevant to what we do. What really honestly has helped us is that it's a word of mouth in certain areas, that if the producers talk, and so if one is moving down a new area that they're seeing positive results from, or have the possibility to advance forward, they will let their neighbors know. And the word of mouth really has a positive effect for us, and especially we need to work in a certain geography that once word is out, we receive back quite a few inquiries into those areas, and being easy to work with, communicative to the producers as well, is a benefit. And so it's not just turning this loose and putting everything on the producer. It's walking them through everything that they need to do, being a resource for them, answering questions, and going above and beyond, even if it's not what we're working on. If they have questions about other areas, helping them with that. So being service provider in a different way for them as well, as I think help overcome and at least get the movement forward in the areas we need to go for data collection.
Great. Whitney?
Super quick build on that. I think something else is alignment of buyers. and retailers. So thinking about supply chains, if you have a Mott's who is purchasing apples from farmers, these farmers are also selling into, say, a Whole Foods or a Walmart and selling their apples in there. So if we can align across what are we looking for, what are those metrics, like you've talked about already, Ryan, but retailers especially, an alignment of definitions and metrics. And you were talking about what new research, Sarina, is needed, and it's hearing a little bit about the IPM Alliance and a focus on supply chains was getting me excited, because if the research can be looking at cases where you have various actors in a supply chain at the table, I think that's really powerful.
Great. We've got about 5 more minutes left to go, and I just want to wrap up this session. I want to get your takeaway thoughts on, if you came back to this topic in another 5 years, and Julie's already sort of identified that this is a fast-moving area. It is different to what was happening 10 years ago. But if you came back in 5 years, what would be one of the key challenges you want to overcome? And you can be very specific or you can be very general, but what would be some of the key things that you see as a barrier right now that you'd like to just have magically disappeared, maybe through research and development activities? Maybe I'll start with Julie.
So I talked a little bit about this in terms of the cost and the difficulty of being able to kind of collect and aggregate that primary data. And right now, the amount that an individual farmer or a cooperative or a group need to be able to do to be able to enact that. And so I look forward to a day when we have better systems that are set up so that it is not as difficult. You can get instantaneous data and the ability to be able to change from that.
Wonderful. That's a lovely vision. Reagan.
Yeah, I mean, mine is very similar. I think having a larger depth of a database for comparison in new methodologies or products, as I was saying before, it's one of the major concerns in the LCA space. And then the other one is a way to model soil organic carbon, not to replace thorough MRV, but to help sort of inform earlier stage decision making for companies that maybe can't afford or do not have access to the full soil sampling. Those are the 2 places that I would like to see growth.
Wonderful. Whitney?
I'm going to chime in with a vision of ease of leveraged funds from other sources. So we talked about the taxes example before. Another one that we've thought about is, could not growers that are implementing these practices have lower crop insurance rates? Like, how can you just keep stacking these benefits so that cost really then is eliminated essentially over the benefits? And I know from discussions with many of the growers we buy from that the NRCS applications are burdensome to them, and that many of them just don't even try. So that's something we've been looking at too. How can we help facilitate that? But if you could just stack all of these, that would be a beautiful thing.
Wonderful. Ryan?
Yeah, I'd like to see that we stop thinking about environmental performance and production performance as competing objectives, especially when it comes to scale. And right now, there's a massive disconnect on the producer side between those 2 different goals. And so I really think that as we move this industry forward, the most advanced systems are going to include production, resource efficiency, resilience, and environmental performance all in one, and going to be viewed at equally between all those different. And so I think when we can finally put those all together, we can become extremely economically durable, as well as production should hopefully increase along with that.
Wonderful. Well, that's some very, very exciting things that we can work on in the next 5 years. I'm sure we'll get them all done and fixed for you. No worries. I want to thank all of our panelists today. I know that I haven't got to all the questions in the Q&A box. There's definitely some really good ones there that we didn't cover, so I would encourage everyone to have a read through those when they can. But we are running out of time, so I just want to really thank our panelists for their thoughts, ideas and feedback, and really encourage them to continue to have discussions around IPM, because sometimes IPM does sit in its own little bubble. And really, we do want to be integrating with these payments for ecosystem service schemes and other sustainability practices going forward, because there is huge opportunities here, I think, for growers and for community groups and for retailers and consumers to see some of the benefits associated with these change of practices on farm. With that, I might hand over to Tien and Erika or Jim. Who am I handing to?
I can take it over. I think Tien has some.
Thank you, Erika.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been an incredible discussion. Just to close us out, here's some contact information if you'd like to learn more about this initiative. And then the rest of the series can also be found on our website, and we will be sending you the recording. And yeah, thanks for attending, everybody, and thanks to our wonderful panelists. And yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Thank you.